A crime has been committed. The victim, the American political system. Autopsy shows wounds in the shape of increasing partisanship, inaction, demagoguery, conspiracism, and extremism. Today, I'll make the case to you that the cause has been the unassuming American primary election. But first of all, what even is a primary election? Well, a primary is a method of choosing the nominees for a political party. In the United States, this is generally done by having elections, which, depending on the state, might be open to everyone who's registered to vote or closed to people who are registered with the party that's having the election. More rare is the caucus, which functions as kind of a community meeting for members of the party to decide who they'll support in an election. Primary elections feel like they've been around forever. They feel like they're these age-old institutions, but in reality, they've only been important to congressional races since the early 20th century. And in fact, for presidential races, they've only been important since the 1970s. Before that, nominees were basically decided by party insiders, a classic smoke-filled room image. From their very inception, primaries have been weapons. The first American primaries were instituted in the South. They were only open to white people. It wasn't until the 1940s that whites-only primaries ended after the Supreme Court struck them down in the state of Texas. The people who instituted the whites-only primaries knew that by controlling who was given the Democratic Party nomination, they could control who won the general election. This is because the Democratic Party was overwhelmingly dominant in the American South at this time. Over the next couple decades, a lot changed. For example, the Republican Southern strategy began the political realignment of the South, principally on the basis of opposition to the Civil Rights Act. One thing that didn't change, however, was our collective allegiance to the two-party system, to the Republican and Democratic parties. If you were to ask me when that changed, when our collective allegiance to the Republican and Democratic parties began to crack, I'd paraphrase Ernest Hemingway and say that it happened gradually and then suddenly. Vietnam, Watergate, the Reagan Revolution, these were all cracks, but through it all, the percentage of Americans who identified as politically independent was always less than at least one of the major parties. That is, until 1989, and the ascension of a man named Newt Gingrich to the position of House Minority Whip.
There was an across-the-board interest in a more activist, more creative, more energetic style. And I think that's what that signaled.
Newt Gingrich believed that if the Republican Party wanted to start winning more elections, they needed to get more aggressive, much more aggressive. And this all started with the language. Gingrich, harnessing the organizational and funding power of a group called GOPAC, told Republicans they needed to start speaking a lot more like him. GOPAC released a memo called Language, a Key Mechanism of Control, which directed Republicans to start describing themselves and their goals with terms like crusade, activist, conflict, and common sense, and directed Republican candidates to refer to Democrats and the Democratic Party with words like decay, sick, pathetic, traitors, anti-flag, anti-family, anti-child, anti-jobs, cheat, and steal. The idea was to divide America. GOPAC literally encouraged candidates to use us versus them language to manufacture this division. But mobilizing Republicans against Democrats was not enough. Gingrich and his allies wanted more than a majority in Congress. They wanted purity within the Republican Party. So what did? They weaponized the primary. The message was clear: toe the line or face a well-funded primary challenger who will. In Vermont in 1990, the NRA, these guys.
From my cold, dead hands.
They united with conservatives in Vermont to oust a moderate Republican named Peter Smith in favor of a little-known mayor of Burlington, Vermont. Maybe you've heard of him.
I think there may be some symbolism here.
That's right. The Republicans of the early 90s helped to elect self-described socialist Bernie Sanders in order to avoid dealing with a troublesome moderate Republican. The politics was cutthroat, but it absolutely worked.
By sunrise, the shift in power was so seismic, the earth under the Capitol might as well have moved.
In the 1994 midterms, the Republican Revolution swept the House of Representatives and swept Newt Gingrich into power as Speaker of the House in 1995. Gingrich was finally conductor, but this train was already way off the tracks. Activist, aggressive, oppositional Republican politics was now the norm. And like many revolutions, the Republican revolutions didn't hesitate to begin devouring its own. Our Republican Robespierre faced the political guillotine only 4 years later when he was in turn ousted by insurgent Republicans eager for newer, more activist, more radical opposition to President Bill Clinton. Since then, literally every Republican Speaker of the House has been troubled by this conflict within the party. That conflict even brought down two of them for good. Boehner and McCarthy were both swept from their high perch by Republican hardliners. These days, in a bit of poetic justice, you can find Newt Gingrich trapped in a Fox News talking head square, condemning modern Republican insurgents like Matt Gaetz. Since the 1990s, the parties have continued to diverge, with Republicans especially becoming much more conservative in terms of how they vote in Congress. As Congress has continued to polarize, the two parties have become less appealing to Americans. Identification with the two major parties is basically on the floor, with over 40% of Americans now identifying as politically independent. You might think that as more and more Americans express their dissatisfaction for what's being offered by the Republican and Democratic parties by identifying as politically independent, that the parties would change their strategy in order to appeal more to some of these voters that they've lost. This would be the case if the two parties were actually in danger of being displaced by some other kind of competition, a third party, for example. But due to a principle in political science called Duverger's law, which I'll leave a link for you to read about, mounting an effective or serious third party challenge to the two major parties is incredibly difficult, bordering on impossible, as long as one of them doesn't implode on their own or something. That's why a two party system has existed in the United States for practically its entire existence. And if we wanted to change that, if we wanted to eliminate the two party system, we would basically need to change our entire way of doing elections, which is a good topic for a different video. But what does this all have to do with primaries destroying politics? Well, if Republican and Democratic primaries are how we determine who our candidates will be, and if today Americans are less likely than ever to identify with the parties that control the primaries, just as these parties are becoming more ideologically polarized, then that means our options in elections are being controlled by a tiny, totally unrepresentative minority of political partisans. Democracy is often colloquially defined as the rule of the majority. In reality, democracy is the rule of the majority who show up. A majority of Americans believe that neither Biden nor Trump should be running again in 2024, but the largest portion of Americans don't even consider themselves to be part of the organizations that make that decision for us. And only 10% of Americans actually exercise their right to vote in the Republican or Democratic primaries this year, this election cycle. But it's not just the presidential election, it is every election with a primary. Lower rates of party identification means that every election with a primary attached to it is effectively controlled by, or in districts where only one party is realistically competitive, actively decided by increasingly more partisan voters who have pushed out, by force or by sheer force of repulsion, less partisan voters. Now, there's a reason I framed this conversation with the historical context of Newt Gingrich, and it's because I couldn't be honest about this issue without addressing the fact that this isn't exactly a both sides thing. While Democrats, based on congressional voting records, have moved slightly to the left, and some primary challengers have successfully toppled more moderate Democrats, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's defeat of Joe Crowley in 2018 comes to mind. There's a sizable element of the Republican Party that works to make the GOP completely inhospitable to less radical views. Don't believe me? House Republicans have thrown out multiple speakers in the last 10 years in search of more radicalism, and they just tried to do it again with Mike Johnson. In 2016 and 2020, Democrats chose moderate, relatively mainstream liberal candidates over more radical options like Bernie Sanders, and Republicans chose Donald Trump. Republicans with unquestionable bona fides like Liz Cheney have actually been expelled from state parties, and Republicans admit that they're so scared of primaries that they won't co-sponsor legislation drafted by their own party leaders. Even at the state level, Republican leaders like Greg Abbott in Texas openly campaign against members of their own party in primaries in order to oust more moderate members. The deeper we look at this situation, the less this story seems to be about how the primary destroyed politics, but about how the primary slowly destroyed the very idea of a moderate Republican, as members were forced to either radicalize with the increasingly partisan, increasingly small percentage of the population that votes in Republican primaries, or be replaced, which in turn completely upended politics. It was Republicans who weaponized the primary this time, but the problem is structural. We need to think seriously about the fact that our political system is held hostage by a tiny proportion of the population that actually participates in these clubs we call political parties that choose who appear on our ballots. The way I see it, returning to the old days where an even more unrepresentative group full of old men in smoke-filled rooms pick the nominees is not an option. In that case, we have two paths forward in order to rescue politics from this broken and easily weaponized system. First, the only permanent solution would be to totally reform our electoral system. This would include things like controlling gerrymandering, making changes that allow more than two parties to be viable in the United States, or restructuring the way that we do primaries so they either function completely differently or just matter a whole lot less. Our second option, and probably what we should be doing even as we work toward the first option, is to just be more politically active as a country. Remember, the fewer people that participate, the easier it is to overwhelm voices of reason with ideologically motivated partisans. If you want your party to represent you, and if you, like the majority of Americans, didn't want to see a Biden versus Trump rematch in 2024, then you have to participate. The boss of the infamous Tammany Hall political machine, William Tweed, said that he didn't care who did the electing as long as he got to do the nominating. That sentiment was true then, and it is true now. In conclusion, and if you'll let me extend my analogy from the beginning of this video just a little further, primaries are the smoking gun, but Newt Gingrich and his stylistic successors pulled the trigger, and the body looks suspiciously like a liberal Republican. All right, everybody, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. All right, see you next time.